Nice and loud.
Okay, good. So this is the din haskaras hayruach v'geshem v'tal, mentioning wind, rain, and dew. Uva yud aleph seifim, and in it there's 11 paragraphs. Bracha shniya, the second blessing of the Shemona Esrei, which is called the Ato Gibor. You speak about Hashem's strength. That bracha, Eina Pesachas bebaruch, does not start with the word baruch, because it is close to the bracha that is before it, and a bracha that's attached to another bracha. You don't start off with baruch atah. It starts off with ato gibor. It's like a continuation. All the brachas, the other brachas of Shemona Esrei, they're all close to the one next to it. Therefore, they end with baruch, but they don't start with baruch. So again, a typical bracha would start with baruch, like Asher Bachar Banim Mikol Ha'amim, the Nasan Lanu Es Terasai, and then it would end with baruch, Baruch Atah Hashem Noisein HaTorah. That would be like a typical bracha. But the brachas of Shemona Esrei don't have that. Ato Chaynein, you don't start with baruch, but you end Baruch Atah Hashem Chaynein Hadoas. You end with baruch. So the same as like Ato Gibor. Ato Gibor does not start with baruch, but it ends with baruch Atah Hashem Machaya HaMesim. So that's just a rule, a side point about the why it starts that way and how it ends. Okay, now we get to the laws of the mentioning rain. Maschilan lahazkar ageshem bracha shniya. We mention rain in that second bracha called the Ato Gibor bracha. B'tfilas musaf shel Shmini Atzeres. You start in the tfilas musaf of Shmini Atzeres. Vein poisken at tfilas musaf shel Yom Tov Harishon shel Pesach. And you don't stop until the first day of Pesach Musaf. So this is an important line. This mention is an arousal of what we will ask. Ritzui she'ela. It's like an appeasement before we ask. Sheterem sheyishalu hageshamim. That before you ask for the rain, ba'inasam, in its time, kishiyagiaz mana she'ela, when the time to ask arrives. Miratzin lafanav, we arouse before him, we appease before Hashem, bahazkaras k'vuraisav, mentioning his strength, shemayrid geshamim, that he gives rain. B'kavo azkarazu b'berchas machaya hamesim, they attached this bracha, they established it in the bracha of machaya hamesim, nesha geshamim heim shkulim ketchias hamesim, because geshem, rain, is equal to giving life, resurrection of the dead. Why is it equal? Shekshem, that just like Shatchias HaMesim, by the resurrection of the dead, Chayim Li'olam, it's life for the world. Kach HaGeshamim Chayim Li'olam, also rain is life for the world. Now, V'haya men adin lahazkir u'laratzos l'fanav miyom tov harishon shel chag. Logic would tell us to start mentioning and appeasing Hashem and praising Hashem on the first day of Sukkot. Why? Shebechag, because on Sukkot, nidoinem al hamayim, we are judged on water. So it would be a good time to start mentioning the Hashem's power that He gives rain. Ela but lafisha geshamim heim siman klala b'chag HaSukkah, since geshamim is a omen of curse on Sukkot. You can't sit in the sukkah while it's raining. So ein mazkiran geshem, you don't mention rain adavor zayin yemei yeshiva b'sukkah, until you finish the 7 days of dwelling in the sukkah. You really should start Ma'ariv time. Why do we start Musaf? So you don't start Ma'ariv. You can't start at Ma'ariv time because people aren't in shul. And this we mentioned. It'll end up that some people will mention the rain, and some people won't mention it because people aren't in shul. They'll make that there'll be some Yidden mentioning it, some don't. So therefore, we don't mention it. We don't establish. The rabbis didn't establish to do it at the Ma'ariv prayer. Now, what about Shachris? Lamed maskir b'Shachris. So we said two reasons why we don't do it at Shachris. One reason we said was because you're not allowed to interrupt the davening by announcing Mashav Aruch Amar Geshem. You can't make that announcement because you're not allowed to interrupt between Geula and Tefillah, between the Bracha Goal Yisrael and the davening. So because you can't make an interruption, therefore we don't do it at Shachris because you got to announce it. And then we had it, and that reason the Alter Rebbe brings here. Why can't you mention the Shachris? We should also lahazkir Geshem. It's prohibited to mention the rain until the Chazan or the Gabbai announces b'kol ram with a loud voice. Merid HaGeshem Kaidim HaTfilah. He has to announce that Hashem gives you should mention Merid HaGeshem, that Hashem gives rain before the Tefillah. But on the morning davening, Shachris, you can't make that announcement. You need to have Geula and Tefillah next to each other without interruption. And therefore, you can't do it in Shachris. And the Alter Rebbe then adds that Lefichach af mishu chayla yonos, even someone who's sick, or he's not able to come to shul, he would normally be allowed to daven before the congregation, even though we normally say you're not supposed to daven before the congregation, but there are exceptions, like someone who's sick and he's in an emergency situation. So he would be allowed to daven normally early, even if he's in shul, he could daven before the congregation. But like it says in chapter 90, but asur loy lahaktim tfilas musaf shel shmini atzeres l'tfilas atzibar, but it's prohibited for him to daven musaf of shmini atzeres early. He can't do it before the community does it. So this is a trick question. When during the year are you not allowed to daven? If you're in your own house, you can't daven before the community davens, and that's the answer is musaf on shmini atzeres. Why? Because you're not allowed to mention rain until the announcer in shul mentions the rain. So therefore, the law is that even if you're at home, you're not allowed to daven before the community, before the congregation davens. You're not allowed to mention the rain until it's mentioned in the community, in the congregation. But if you know that they announced it, even if you didn't hear it from the Gabbai or the Chazan, Mazkir, then you could mention it. Because of this reason, if he comes late to the shul and they started davening already Musaf, but you didn't hear the Chazan say it, you could still daven with them with saying Mashav Haruach. Yispalel v'yazkir, he should daven and mention that Hashem gives rain. Even though he didn't hear Kishach Rizu when they announced it. And nevertheless, he should say Mashav Aruch Mar Geshem because they did announce it already, and that's enough for him to recite Mashav Aruach in his Musaf, even though he came late and missed the announcement. And the person who lived, yes.
That means you're not allowed to pray that day before the Bet Knesset.
That's right.
Every day. Not every day.
When is the day that you're not allowed to daven before the community? Shmini Atzeres.
Yeah.
And we'll soon see about the first day of Pesach. We'll soon see about that. But there is one day so far that we know of. You're not allowed to daven early, and that's Shmini Atzeres. You can't daven Musaf before the congregation. And if a person, the end of this paragraph, this is the first paragraph of this chapter, the end of it says, V'hadar b'makam shein minyan. What about a person who lives in a place where they don't have a quorum of minyan of 10 people? Yamtin, he has to wait. He should wait till the normal time that they daven, till the time that they're davening in the different communities, and then he should daven as well. So there's some element here of the announcement has to be made before you start saying Mashiv Haruach or Merid HaGeshem. And once that announcement is made, then you start saying Mashiv Haruach Merid HaGeshem. Now, if someone's in shul and they did not daven Shachris yet, they're running late, and the community is up to Musaf, and they hear the announcement of Musaf, then for sure they have to say Mashiv Haruach Merid HaGeshem in their Shachris prayer. That means someone would have to switch the norm, go against the tide, do different than everyone else, and they would have to do in their Shachris, in their morning davening, they would have to add in Mashiv Haruach Merid HaGeshem, even though the whole community doesn't do that. But since they were in shul and they heard the announcement, they would end up needing to include Mashiv Haruach in their Shachris prayer. Now, if they're not in shul and they're at home, that would be questionable. There seems to be different opinions if they would need to say Mashiv Haruach Merid HaGeshem. What it seems from the Piskei Tshuvos is that it seems here that if someone normally goes to a certain shul and they already daven Musaf, they already made the announcement of Mashiv Haruach, so that person, even if he's still up to Shachris, he would need to include Mashiv Haruach in his davening. Sounds like even if he's not in shul. However, I believe, and I know that there's a letter from the Rebbe, and I didn't look it up, but I believe there's a letter from the Rebbe about this that maybe that I believe holds the opposite. That if he's not in shul, he didn't hear the announcement, he would not say it in his davening. Only if you hear the announcement. In any event, it seems to be a discussion, definitely something that you don't want to get yourself into such a problem. So that's one day you don't want to come late to shul. Shmini Atzeres, daven with the minyan, you won't have any problems. Come late, you can start having some issues. Even if you daven at home, there's some issues. It's unclear. Should you say Mashiv Haruach? Shouldn't you say Mashiv Haruach? It's also a day that you cannot daven Musaf early. You cannot daven Musaf before the congregation. It's clear in Shulchan Aruch. It's usher. Even a person who's not well shouldn't daven before the congregation and Shmini Atzeres. Now, what about the ending Mashiv Haruach? So we end on Musaf of Pesach. We don't stop mentioning rain, mentioning Hashem's greatness that He gives rain, until they make an announcement in the shul of Moirid Hatol. At least this is in Nusach Sfard congregations or Nusach Ari, where they announce Moirid Hatol before Musaf on the first day of Pesach. In places where the minhag, in places where the minhag is to say Merid Hatol, instead of Merid HaGeshem, instead of Merid HaGeshem, in the summer they say Merid Hatol. Shachrazas Hatal, because announcing that you should mention rain. The Hachrazas, the announcement Hatal of dew, Simin hu lahem, that's a sign for them, lahafsakas haskaras hageshem, to stop mentioning rain. So when do we make the changeover? So for those communities where they say the words Moirid Hatol and they make an announcement, Moirid Hatol, that announcement is made before Musaf. And so everyone during Musaf davens Mayrid Hatol, and they skip out Mashiv Haruach. So that's when we stop Mashiv Haruach. And what is the announcement to stop Mashiv Haruach Mayrid HaGeshem? The announcement to stop it is the announcement of Mayrid Hatol. That announcement that Hashem brings due is an announcement really that's telling you stop saying Mashiv Haruach Mayrid HaGeshem. Stop saying that Hashem brings rain. Kedei shelo yihi davar me'urav beineihem. Shezeh mazkir v'zeh einay mazkir. V'yeh agudas aguday. So there won't be different people doing different things. Therefore, they make this announcement of Mayrid Hatol. But what about an individual that's davening on his own? What does this mean? He's allowed to mention Tal instead of Geshem. In other words, let me finish the paragraph and then I'll explain it. V'mdinas elu, in these countries that they do not say Tal, she'einayim lahaskir Tal b'meisachama b'makam Geshem. They don't mention Mayrid Hatol. This is called Ashkenaz, Nusach Ashkenaz. Ve'einach rozas Tal siman klal afsakos askaras Geshem. And announcing Tal is not a sign for them to stop saying Geshem, because in the Nusach Ashkenaz, in that text, they don't mention Tal, they don't mention dew. So Noyagin Shalei Lahafsik Lahaskir Geshem, the custom is not to stop Ad Tfilas HaMincha until Mincha davening, Sheshama Kvar Mishatz, they already heard from the Shliach Tzibur Shapasak Tfilas Musaf that he stops in the Musaf repetition. But in the davening of Musaf, the whole congregation and the Chazan, Mazkirin Geshem in their quiet Shmona Esrei b'Tfilas Lachash, Kedei shelo yiya davar me'urav bein hatzibur, so that there wouldn't be a confusion between the congregation. She'ef shel hachris koydem hatfilah, because you cannot announce before davening. Sheyafsiku milahazkir, stop saying Hageshem. Why don't you make such an announcement? It looks like they don't want Hashem's rain. Al derech sha'amru, similar to the way it says that they say, Ein mispalim al roiv tova. You can't daven to Hashem to stop something that's good. The too much good, we don't daven to Hashem for. Now, umasheina shatz poisek b'tfilas hashachar. Why don't they stop in Shachris saying? Why don't they just stop in the Shachris davening, and they could stop saying the Geshem in the Tfilas Shachris? The Shliach Tzibur could stop in his repetition of Shachris. Umishum oisam shloi hayu b'beis hakneses ba'arvis, because there's people who weren't there in Shul the night before. When they hear that the Shatz is not mentioning it in Shachris, in the repetition, they'll think that you stop mentioning it in Ma'ariv, because the Jewish day goes after the night. So if they're stopping to say Mashiv Haruach by day, maybe they started the night before when I didn't go to Shul. B'chol makom, in every place. And then the next year there's going to be people who aren't going to mention it at night in Ma'ariv, because they'll say, "Oh, I remember last year I went to Shul Shachris. They weren't mentioning it. Probably they started in Ma'ariv." And if it's Zem Maskir, Zayin Maskir, it's going to end up being that some will mention it, some won't. So what's interesting here is that the Alter Rebbe brings both of these reasons, two reasons, about not mentioning in Shachris. When he talks about Mashiv Haruach, he says you can't start in Shachris because we're dealing with an hefsek. You announce Mashiv Haruach, that's a hefsek. When he talks about stopping Mashiv Haruach and not saying anything in the Ashkenaz community, he says, why don't you start in Shachris? meaning in the Chazaras Hashatz, in the repetition of the Chazan, he should see in his Shemona Esrei they could stop saying they could stop saying
Morida Geshem.
Mashav Haruach. They should stop saying it by Musaf on Pesach, by Shachar. Let them stop at Shachris. He says there, it's not a problem of interruption because the Shliach Tzibor they're not announcing anything. They don't announce anything when you stop saying it. It's just the Shliach Tzibor stops. So it's not a problem of interruption over there. And it's also the Shliach Tzibor, it's in the repetition. It's not in the quiet Shemona Esrei. The only issue there is that people are going to start thinking that they stopped in Ma'ariv time. The people are going to think, they probably stopped. I wasn't in shul last night, but maybe last night they already stopped saying it. So that's where that reason kicks in. And therefore, you don't change in Shachris, you change in the Musaf. So in Shachris, they mention Mashav Haruach on the first day of Pesach. And in Ashkenazic communities, even in Musaf, in the quiet Shemona Esrei, they do mention Mashav Haruach, and they only change at Mincha time, and in the repetition of Musaf, and then in the repetition of Musaf it changes, and then that's like an announcement, I guess, at the repetition of Musaf. That's where everything changes. Now the announcement in Nusach Sfard communities, so the announcement of Morid Hatol, that's where things change. In that announcement, you can announce before Musaf. So even in the quiet Shemona Esrei, in such communities, even in the quiet Shemona Esrei, you can announce it, and therefore they announce it before Musaf, and therefore for Musaf, people stop saying Mashav Haruach. So again, there's a big difference between the Ashkenaz and Nusach Sfard, because you can't announce stop saying Mashiv Haruach Merda Geshem. That's an announcement that's not appropriate. You don't say, Chevra, stop saying Mashiv Haruach that Hashem gives rain. Stop saying Hashem gives rain. You can't make such an announcement. So if you make an announcement, Merda Tol, so that's a sign that you stop saying Mashiv Haruach, but you don't say it. You don't announce such a thing. So going back to what we were saying before, in the Nusach Sfard congregation, they make that announcement before Musaf, and before this announcement, no one, Ein Atzibar Mafsikin, you don't stop saying Geshem, but only after, because you don't want there to be a difference of the community in the communities. But a yachid, but an individual that's davening on his own, he's allowed to mention the Tal instead of Geshem. He would be allowed to mention Tal instead of Geshem, and it seems because Tal is not like an obligation to mention. So it's not like you have to wait till the Chazan announces it. So it seems that maybe you could daven early, even in such even in a place where they announce Morid Hatol, you want to daven Musaf early, it seems that you would be allowed to in the first day of Pesach, because Tal do is not something that's like an obligatory mention. It's only customary. Okay, so that touches on the difference between Nusach Ashkenaz and Nusach Sfard, and it gives us an interesting reason why there's a difference between when you stop mentioning Mashiv Haruach. According to Nusach Ashkenaz, you stop after Musaf, and you only start not saying it in your Mincha Shemona Esrei. The Chazan in the repetition, and the community stops in the Mincha. But in the Nusach Sfard, they stop Mashiv Haruach in the Musaf Shemona Esrei, the whole community, because there is an announcement that they make, and that's called the Morid Hatol. We have to start praising Hashem for giving dew. Now the Alter Rebbe talks about our Gemara. Tal uveruchos leichivu chachamim lahazkir. The dew and the wind, the rabbis did not obligate us to mention. So even though we mention Morid Hatol in the summer, we're not obligated to mention it. And even though in the winter we mention The same tal umatar livrach. Hashem gives dew. In the winter, everyone mentions dew. They're not obligated to. Loy chivu chachamim lahazkir. Loy behazkara. Not in mentioning in the bracha, Sheba bracha, Machaya Mesim. V'loy b'she'ela. You don't have to ask for it in the Sheba Berachas Hashanim, in the bracha of Baruch Aleinu, in the Mavarech Hashanim blessing, you don't have to ask for dew, and you don't have to mention dew in the second bracha of Shemoneh Esrei. Mipnei she'enon ne'etzarin li'olam, because they never are withheld. This is our Gemara. And when it says you don't have to mention it, the Alter Rebbe explains it means both in the mentioning and in the asking. You don't have to even ask for it. Even though everyone says v'sein talu matar, you don't have to say v'sein talu matar. You could just say v'sein matar. But we mentioned the custom is to mention v'sein talu matar, and nusach sfar, the custom is to mention morid hatov. V'im hazkir mazkir, if you want to mention it, you can mention it. Now v'noyag in mechol hamakoymos loymar mashiv haruach v'hazkar. Now we jump to ruach. So ruchos, the winds. Do we mention wind? So the community mentions wind in the winter. Mashiv haruach u'marid hageshem. So what about winds? All places have a minhag to mention wind, that Hashem blows the winds in this bracha during the winter of the second bracha of Shemoneh Esrei. We don't mention winds when we ask for when we put in our requests, which is in the bracha of Baruch Aleinu, in the middle of the middle blessings. We don't mention wind, but we do mention it in the praises of Hashem in the second bracha. But in the summer, we don't mention it at all. It's only wanted in the winter. To dry up the wetness of the earth, shahu maruba. A lot of interesting little insights here. Why do we mention the ruach in the winter? Because we want to dry up the moisture. That's too much. That's meruba. It's an abundance of moisture. So we mention the wind in the winter. Everyone mentions it. Why? You don't have to mention it, because it's a good thing then. It's wanted then, but it's not wanted in the summer. The winds are not wanted so much in the summer. They're wanted in the winter to dry up the wetness of the earth. If you didn't mention the wind in the winter, which is when it's wanted, or you did mention it in the summer when it's not so wanted, you don't have to repeat Shemoneh Esrei, even if you did not conclude the blessing, so you could easily just go back. Don't go back. You skipped it in the winter, no problem. You mentioned it in the summer, no problem. Now, what about the dew? Now we jump back to dew. Now we're jumping to dew. Now, dew is always wanted. There are places that the minhag is to mention it in the summer, like Nusach Sfard. And they ask for it. Now, this is surprising. There are places, I'll have to ask my Sephardic friends. Maybe they ask for dew in the summer. Everyone asks for it in the winter, and we mention it in the summer, but we don't ask that. Nusach Sfar does not ask for it. We don't ask for it in the summer. We don't ask for dew. But maybe the real Sfard, not Nusach Sfard, but the real Sephardic people, they maybe ask for it. I guess I would guess that this is referring to the real Sephardic people, not the Nusach Sfard. Maybe they ask for dew even in the summer. Now, even though it's never withheld, mikol makam, nevertheless, Mivakshim sheyiyah lebracha. That's our Gemara. Nevertheless, we want that it should be for a blessing. So we can mention it, we can ask for it all year round because we want the blessing part of it. It's never withheld, but we want it to be for a blessing. Sometimes the dew could be not for a blessing. Now, what happens if you mentioned it in the winter, the dew, Morid Hatal, or you didn't mention it? I'm sorry, you mentioned it in the winter, instead of saying Masha Varuach Merda Geshem, you mentioned Merda Tol, or Shaloi his Kiru Bimaisa Chama, or you didn't mention Merda Tol in the summer, which is some have a custom to mention it, you didn't. Or you skipped it, whether in the summer or the winter. In other words, you said the same you didn't say the same tal, you just said the same mutter in the winter, or you just said the same bracha in the summer. Ein machzirin oisoi, you don't have to go back. Afilo loisiyam adayin bracha, even if you didn't finish the bracha. Me'achar shleichivu chachamim klal lahazkir b'tal v'ruchais, because the rabbis never obligated you to mention dew and winds, even though dew, there's a reason to mention that it should be lebracha, and dew is always good, and wind, we said, is very good in the winter, which is the reason why we mention it in the winter. Even all nuschais, all the customs, they all mention wind in the winter, not because you need to, but because it's wanted in the winter. It dries out the moisture, the winds. In these countries, we mention the same talu mutter, but we don't mention it not during the summer. We don't mention tal. And they don't mention it in Nusach Ashkenaz, not in the request, they mention it in the winter, not in the summer. In the mention of it, which is the second bracha of Shemoneh Esrei, they don't say it in Nusach Ashkenaz, not not in the summer, not in the winter. If you mentioned it, and he asked for it in Machzir, you don't have to go back. Like, for example, if he says the same tal, but he doesn't say umater, you have to correct that. So this would be an interesting question. If a person davened, he's a chazan, and it's during the summer. You're not supposed to ask for rain. And he gets up there and he says, the same tal. And everyone quickly corrects him. No, the same bracha. What does he have to do? If you say something wrong and you wait like 3 seconds, you're supposed to go back to the beginning of the bracha. So he said the same tal. He didn't say umatar. And it's the summer when you're not supposed to ask for rain. He said give dew, but he didn't say and rain. Does he have to go back to the beginning of Barei Choleno? If he waited a few seconds, then you go back to the beginning of the paragraph. So does he have to do that, or can he just continue? Livracha al pnei ha'adama, same bracha al pnei ha'adama. So the according to this, he doesn't have to go back, because tal, you can mention it any time. So mention tal in the summer, no problem. He asks for it, no problem. So you don't have to go back and correct that line, or do Vasein again, the same bracha, because there's nothing wrong with saying tal. You get that? Everyone following? Okay, now we're up to paragraph 4. Im Amar Marid Ageshem Maisachama, if he says in the summer that it should rain, now this is a big problem. Then it's Machzira Naisa, then you got to go back. Because rain, these are Geshamim Maisachama, Inam Elasim and Klala. That's like a sign of curse. Lachein etzrichu lazeh shehizkir klala b'tfilasai sheyachzav yispalel b'lay klala oisa bracha shehizkir ba. You have to go back and say that bracha, do that bracha again that you missed, that shouldn't be for a curse. Shizkir Baklala, that you mentioned curse in it, you got to go back and repeat it. And the problem is, in the first three brachas of Shemona Esrei, they're like one. So when you have to go back, you often will have to go back to the beginning of the Shemona Esrei. To go back to the beginning of the bracha, if you go back to the middle, it's not going to correct what you mentioned inappropriately. Because the din, it's not going to correct what you mentioned inappropriately, because this mention is to say Morid HaGeshem before Mechalkel Chayim. So you can't go back to Mechalkel Chayim because Mashiv HaRuach comes before that. So you have to go back to the beginning, not just Mechalkel Chayim. You have to go back to Ato Gibor. Now, if you finish the bracha, so again, I mentioned a little too early, prematurely. If you finish the bracha completely, then you would need to go all the way back to the beginning of Shemona Esrei. That's it's going to mention soon. But what it's saying now is you have to start the beginning of the bracha appropriately. When you mention something wrong, you got to go back to the beginning of this bracha, not to Mechalkel Chayim, but to Ato Gibor. That's what it's saying now. You can't just go back to Mechalkel Chayim. Now, if you finished the whole bracha, Sarech Lachzer L'Reish HaTfilah, then you got to go back to the whole beginning of the whole Shemona Esrei. L'fi shekol hatoya be'izu bracha, the person who makes a mistake in any bracha, be'inyan shetzarech lachzer l'sakin tu'usa, in a way that you have to fix it, and you didn't go back v'lei chazar ad shechasam bracha zu, when you finished this bracha, loy, just do it. Second. Okay, just fix that. So a person, oh, did that. Okay, guess it doesn't work. So whoever makes a mistake in any of the bracha in a way that you have to fix the mistake, and you didn't fix it until you finish the bracha, it's not enough to go back to the place where you made the mistake, but rather you have to go back to the beginning of the bracha like it'll be explained. And the first three brachas are chashuvais. They are considered kibracha achas, like one bracha, k'maishe yispar, like it'll be explained. So this is a special law with regard to the first three brachas, that when you mess up, then you got to go back. We'll soon see what that means, that you finished the whole bracha. The explains later that generally means that you started the next bracha. And if you just finished it, you could often just add in right there the addition that you were supposed to mention. But here, the problem was that you said something wrong. So here you do have to go back, because you said something wrong. You can't fix up and add something that you missed. Here you said the Morid HaGeshem in the wrong place, because, in other words, you said it in the summer, the wrong time of the year. It's a Siman Klola. So now you finished that bracha. Even if you didn't start the next bracha, you're going to need to go back, not to the beginning of this bracha, but to the beginning of the whole Shemona Esrei, because the first three brachas are considered like one. Okay, now, halacha 5, even if the rain is not really a curse yet, because it's not the full-fledged summer yet. In the summer in Israel, let's say, it's a curse to have rain, but it doesn't apply right when we switch over, like the beginning of Sukkot. It's not really such a curse that it becomes a real curse in the later in the summer. So even though it's not considered a siman klala, kagain shalayotza dayan nisan shel chama, that the Nisan hasn't passed yet of the summer, and even if the community needs rain at that time, nevertheless, machzira noisa, you got to go back. Why? Because since the majority of time that we stop saying rain is a siman klala, the rabbis made a blanket rule and said, when we stop, you got to stop. When we start, that's the blanket rule. Once we stop mentioning it, if you mention it, you got to go back. And even in lands, now comes the interesting question of what about living in a land that they need rain? Some places that they need rain during the summer months. To the extent that if you did ask for rain in those places, you would not need to repeat Shemona Esrei if you asked for rain, because that community needs rain, like it's explained in the chapter 117. That if you asked for rain in a time that needs rain, even though the halacha normally is that you're not supposed to ask for rain in the summer, but if your community needs rain and you did it, and you asked for rain, you don't have to repeat Shemona Esrei, but that doesn't apply to mentioning rain. That only applies to asking for rain. If you mention rain, then the need of rain doesn't apply to your mentioning Ela l'she'ela. That works when you ask for it, not when you mention it. Because when you ask, you're asking for your land. But mentioning of but mentioning, you are praising Hashem that He gives Geshamim, and you're saying Shaloi Be'itam. You're saying Hashem gives rain when it's not needed. That's a shehem siman klala l'Eretz Yisrael. That's considered it's a siman klala to Eretz Yisrael. You have to go back and repeat that bracha without saying that Hashem does this curse to Klal Yisrael. So that's a very interesting differentiation between if you ask for rain in the wrong time, but your country needs rain, and if you mention it in the wrong time, even though your country needs it, you still have to go back. Now comes the next halacha, and this is where we're going to see that interesting difference with regard to, we'll soon see the difference with regard to starting the next bracha or just finishing. So the case is where it's in the winter and you did not mention rain. You might say Geshem like today. You're supposed to say Mashiv Haruach Merda Geshem. You might say Geshem and Malay Amar Merda Geshem. If you didn't say Merda Geshem, even if you said Mashiv Haruach, Machziranai, so you have to go back. You have to go back to the beginning, either the beginning of this bracha or to the beginning of Shemona Esrei. V'hu shalei hizker tal. That's if you did not mention Merid Hatol. Avalim hizker tal, if you did mention Merid Hatol, then ein machzira noisai, then you don't have to go back. Afilu loisiyem habracha, even if you didn't finish the bracha, don't go and mention rain. She'af she'atal einay netzar, even though dew is never withheld. So how does it help? Mikol makam, nevertheless, shebachu lakodesh baruch hu bazkarasai kumay bazkaras hageshem. It's a praise to Hashem mentioning dew, just like praising Him for rain. Shekshem shageshamim chaim la'olam, just like rain is a life to the world. Kachatalu chaim la'olam, dew is also life to the world. Shal yedei kach misparechas hatfor, because the grain is blessed when it has dew. So therefore, dew has the similar. Dew has a similar power, similar strength as rain, similar praise to Hashem as rain, but wind is not as good. So dew is equal to rain. That's why, as I mentioned, if you say Merid Hatol, you have a benefit, because even in the winter, if you messed up, even in the winter, if you mess up and you mention Tal, Merid Hatol, you don't have to repeat Shemona Esrei. Or if you're not sure if you mentioned it or not, you don't have to repeat Shemona Esrei, because you either mentioned dew or you mentioned rain. Either one, you fulfilled the mitzvah. If you mention wind, it's not good. It's not as good. It's not praise enough. Now, there are many places, I guess, in the Talmud where the dew is called dew of giving of life, which means dew gives life, that resurrects. The dew that's tal techia, the dew of resurrection. Mashenkin aruach, but wind shafshi after leruchas, even though the world needs winds, it's not considered life to the world like rain and dew. And so what we're seeing here are some really giving us a little insight into the Gemara that we're learning, a little understanding of the difference in halacha between these terms and why some of them benefit us if you make a mistake. At least you mentioned this or you didn't mention that. And why do we mention some of them when they're not obligated to be mentioned? So here we have some insights into this about how important dew is. Dew is as a praise to Hashem as much as rain is, and wind is not that way. Wind is maybe good during the winter, but it's not beneficial to the during the summer. We said. Now it mentions therefore there are many people who mention dew all the summer months, all the Kadesha and Yishkachu. What do they gain by mentioning it? So that if they make a mistake, if Yishkachu Loimar Merid Hageshem, if they forget to say Merid Hageshem in the winter, Chazaka Shamru Merid Atol, they probably said Merid Atol, just like they normally do in the summer. Vein Machzir, and I say they won't have to repeat Shemana Esrei. So today, if you make a mistake, let's say, you're not sure if you mentioned rain in your Shemana Esrei, what is the halacha? What is the halacha if you are not sure if you mentioned rain? So if you're Nusach Sfard or Lubavitch, Nusach Ari, you do not need to repeat Shemana Esrei. If you're Nusach Ashkenaz, you need to repeat Shemana Esrei if you're not sure. Why? Because we're within the first 30 days, which we'll soon see. Within the first 30 days, you probably did the Shemana Esrei like you're used to, like you're accustomed to, until we reach a stage of 30 days where you become a new custom, where you created a new custom. Until then, we assume you did it like you did the entire summer. You probably skipped out mentioning rain. And therefore, you would need to say the whole Shemana Esrei again if you forgot to mention rain and you now finished the Shemana Esrei. Now, when does this apply? Bamed Dvarim Aburim, Shemachzira Naisai, that you have to go back and lay Hisker Geshem, you didn't mention rain. V'loi Tal, and you didn't mention Merid Hatol, B'mais HaGesham in the winter. Kishasiyim Kol HaBracha V'Hiskel Bracha Shalachara, when you finish the whole bracha and you start the bracha that's after it. V'az Chayzel L'Reish HaTfilah, then you got to go back to the beginning of the davening, Mitam Shenaspire L'Maila, like we explained earlier, that the first three brachas are all like one. And if you mess up, there's no such thing as starting from the second bracha. It's all one. First, second, and third are all one bracha. And if you mess up, you got to go back to the beginning of the Shemana Esrei. Unless you didn't finish the bracha itself, so you're still in the middle of the second bracha. If you didn't finish it, then fine. Then you could go back to Ata Gibor, and But if you finish that bracha, now so we're saying you have to go back, and that only applies that you finished that bracha and started the next bracha. It says v'hischel bracha shalachara. Then you got to go back. But if you remembered before you finished that bracha, then yomer mashav baruch mered geshem b'makim sheniska, where you remember. The rabbis never said specifically where you need to mention geshem. As long as it's in that bracha of tchias hamesim. The custom is to mention it before Mechal Kachayim. So if you didn't say it, you could say it now in the middle of that bracha. Because Geshem, rain, is like Kalkola, it's like Parnasa. So it fits right there. So it fits right there before Mechalkel Chaim. Mechalkel means Hashem sustains us, like Parnasa, Kalkola, Mechalkel. So it fits right there. We say it there. The rabbis didn't tell us it has to be said exactly in that place. But if you didn't mention it before Mechal Kachayim, so b'chol bracha mekayma, anywhere in the bracha, it's its place. What happens if you finish the whole bracha, but you did not start the third blessing? You don't have to go back. You could say right there before you start the next bracha, you could say it, and it's part of the second bracha. And then afterwards, you could say Atu Kodesh. Since you didn't finish you didn't start the next bracha, it's not called finishing this bracha completely. Regarding things that you have to go back for, even though things that you wouldn't need to go back for, maybe it is considered you finished. That there are certain things that will say don't say it now. Don't say it now because you don't have to go back. But something that you would need to go back for, then you could say it here, even though you didn't start. I'm sorry. You could say it here, and then you will start the bracha afterwards. In those other cases that it says that the Alter Rebbe excludes and says those cases are different. Those cases, even if you didn't start the bracha afterwards, you don't have to go back. You don't have to mention it, even though you didn't start the bracha afterwards. You just skip it. Like Havdalah, you missed out Havdalah, or you missed out Yalav Yavai on the night of Rosh Chodesh. Those places, we don't tell you to add it in here. But because those things you don't have to go back for. But if you miss out Murad Geshem, you would have to go back for it. And that would be the halacha here. So it's giving us some clarity. Now we're supposed to say Mashiv Haruach Murad Geshem. What happens if a person missed it and he finished the bracha? What's the halacha? That you could mention it after the bracha, as long as you didn't say the next bracha, Ata Kodesh. As long as you don't say the word Ata, you could add in Mashiv Haruach Murad Geshem. Gimel brachas rishonos chashuvos kachas. Here in paragraph 8, it says that the first three brachas are all considered like one because it's all about praising Hashem before you ask for your needs, like a servant who mentions praise before his master, before he asks for his reward. And the same thing applies to the last three brachas. They're considered like one, that you're receiving your reward from your master. They're considered like one bracha. And then he goes, therefore, any time that you forget, that you miss out, make a mistake in the first three brachas, you have to go back to the beginning. In the last three brachas, you go back to the beginning of those last three brachas. You don't go to the middle. You go to avoda. Avoda means ritzei. You have to go back to ritzei. Whether he's a yachid, whether he's a tzibur, whether you're davening alone, whether you're the chazan. If you make a mistake that you can't fix, so Ella im kain only Ella im kain yachzer l'reish habracha shetaba kan shetaba chasimasa. Shachasem bracha zu binyan bracha acheres shachasem akela kodesh aseres make shuva v'lainisgar alach de diber sheyev shalei l'sakin to usa yadei sheyachzev yachtim koigen shein chazar miyalas lo b'sech de diber. So the only thing is that if it's a mistake, it's a mistake that you can't fix. Only you have to go back. So you'd have to go back to the beginning of this group, this group of three. And mentions here that there is a concept of Teich de Dibur. If you remember, like by Hakel HaKadosh, here it mentions a few other mistakes that people make, that you would be able to go back if you if you are still within the amount of time it takes to say Shalom Alecha Rebbe. You within that time, in other words, that within 3 words, you remembered, so you could fix it. Now, just skipping a little because we don't have the time and it's not applicable. Now, and halacha 9, it mentions that all of what we just mentioned about there's ways of fixing the mistake, that all applies only if you made the mistake, unintentionally. But if you made a mistake, the mazid, maskavein, and you have in mind to that you'll aval b'mazid or maskavein, if you had in mind to make this mistake, then you got to go back to the beginning of the davening. And the same thing as if you talked b'mazid, you would need to go back to the beginning of the Shemona Esrei. Now it talks about intent, and this is a very important halacha because this is the taisvis that we're about to discuss, and that is that if a person davens and he doesn't know if he mentioned rain or not, it's during the winter, like now, you're not sure. You said Masha V'Ruach Marageshem. So until 30 days, we assume you do what you have been used to in the past. After 30 days, what you need, Mashahut Sarech Humazkir. After 30 days, we assume you did what you need to. Therefore, if you're not sure in the summer, if you mentioned Murda Geshem, so until 30 days, we assume in the summer, we assume you mentioned it until 30 days into the summer because you've been used to all winter saying that we want rain. So therefore, you would need to repeat Shemona Esrei. Tzarech Lachzer, you'd have to go back and repeat Shemona Esrei. Now, in the winter, what do we assume? That in the first 30 days of the winter, meaning first 30 days after Shmini Atzeres, you would need to go back until 30 days because we assume you did not mention it in Nusach Ashkenaz. We assume you didn't mention rain because you were used to not mentioning rain or dew because Nusach Ashkenaz doesn't mention dew. And in the summer, no one mentions rain. So therefore, you would need to return. You didn't need to go back and do the whole Shemona Esrei again. But after 30 days, then you won't need to go back because you've already gotten used to saying Mashiv Haruach Amar Geshem the appropriate way. In Menastam, assumably, you said like Hergil Lashoni like you're used to. And even if you made a mistake a day or two and you didn't daven properly, it doesn't ruin your chazakah. Since you in general you said it right, it's enough. Because you've completed 30 days, we assume that you're used to saying the right thing, and then you don't have to go back if you're not sure. So that's a really important halacha, and we're going to conclude with that. And Zai Gesund, everyone. We will see you later, Mitzvah Shem. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yes.